346, the reaching out to the non-religious. My name is John Hooper. I'm the president of the Humanists, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Now, people who profess no formal religious affiliation make up one of the fastest growing segments of our population. Three approaches to providing the experience of beloved community to these so-called nones will be described today and illustrated by dynamic and respected practitioners. Reverend David Green, Senior Minister of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, will talk about the Humanist congregation. Reverend Marlon Lebanon, Senior Minister of Open Souls Church in Tulsa, will cover the Humanist service, creating a separate humanist experience in the congregation as a theologically diverse membership. Chris Denman, the coordinator of Humanist student life at Yale University, and to meet the Lombard graduate, by the way, along with Sonia David, an MDiv student at Harvard and a student intern with the Humanist community at Harvard, will together describe the Humanist community, which is taking humanist principles and programs beyond the walls of congregations and out into our communities. We have plenty of time. We want to leave plenty of time for questions from you, and because we think this discussion will stimulate many. So let's get into it. I'll turn it over to Reverend.
How's the sound up there?
Very bad.
I got the diaphragm. Just so you know who I am. Now it needs to be louder. Okay. All right, how about that? Yay! I'm sure that you've heard about London's Sunday Assemblies, which have gotten a good deal of media buzz about being an atheist church. They're forming groups in several cities through the United States, and Minneapolis, where I live, happens to be one of them. They approached me about renting space at First Unitarian Society, and we gave them space rent-free to help them get started. One of our stated goals in my congregation is to help small humanist and atheist groups in the Twin Cities to grow by giving them free space or cheap space. They were kind enough to ask me to give the first talk that they had. And so I was able to learn a little bit about how they do church. And also I was able to learn a little bit about how maybe we could do a second service, but we'll let them do it, and we don't have to worry about it. We'll just sleep up afterwards. So it was a win-win for everybody. Little photo from when they were there the first Sunday. You'll notice the banner behind First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the Humanist congregation, established 1881. One of the irritations for us during all of this discussion of an atheist church has been that we've been doing it since 1881, and it's being treated in the media buzz as kind of a new idea. Over 80% of the congregation identifies as either agnostic or atheist. So we've been doing it for a little while. One of the slogans for Sunday Assemblies is, I suppose I need to do it in a British accent, it's all the best. It's a church but with no religion and awesome pop music. That's not too close. Allow me to explain why the mission of Sunday Assemblies so well matches that of my particular congregation. First off, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, formed in 1881, out of a Darwin reading group that was established in Minneapolis. They were post-theist before post-theism was cool. And they have always been explicitly humanist, even before the term humanism was invented in 1916 for that particular kind of humanism. Here's one of our fellows, founders of a church. I know it's a little bit bad there, but that's a Norwegian bachelor you perhaps have heard about. And and also a founder of my congregation. The group had decided they wanted someone who was a great public speaker to engage in the debates concerning natural selection, and they heard about this guy named Henry Simmons living down in Madison, Wisconsin. And they contacted him to come on up and do some speeches around the Twin Cities. He said, okay, sure, I will do that for you. They loved it so much, they said, hey, why don't you become our minister? He said, well, I'm a Unitarian. And they said, well, great, we'll become Unitarian. We'll be a Unitarian church. And that's kind of the level of commitment to Unitarianism that's gone on in my congregation since 1881. Again, bloom where you planted kind of thing, right? So, yes, this is another of our reading group founders, and you can see that she has an expression that in Minnesota passes for extreme rapture. Well, you'll also notice this is a sign that we have up on our building just now. Actually, you know, a problem with updating signs is it actually has been 133 years of teaching evolution for the congregation these days. I think those guys were photographed reading also because, you know, that was the real core value of what they were doing as a congregation. Well, as we went on in history, you may perhaps heard of John Dietrich. He was called to the congregation in 1916. John Dietrich is the man who invented the term religious humanism. He was so popular as a speaker that the church had to give up having services there, and they moved into a downtown theater in downtown Minneapolis. And he spoke to about 1,500 people every Sunday morning from 1916 into the late 1930s, right? I have a member, one of the older members of the congregation who remembers going with her dad to that theater in the 1920s, and she said the marquee read, Sunday morning, noted atheist John Dietrich on the marquee, and below that, Saturday night, striptease with Sally Rand. And if you are a pop culture geek, you may know that Sally Rand invented the bubble dance. Right? She was sort of second to Gypsy Rose Lee, but there you have it. Another of the older members remembers attending the theater in the 1930s, and after the Sunday service, or assembly as we call it, the young people went upstairs for dancing and champagne. Drinks after the service has long been a tradition at our congregation. As a matter of fact, many people still continue that tradition across the street at the art gallery even today. Right? So I think we've been the best bits of church without the church for a very long time, and that's why this appealed to us. If you'll notice, this is from our website. Our motto is a heritage of forward-thinking humanism at home, in the here and the now. To sum it up, the DNA of my particular congregation is a little bit different from most Unitarian Universalist congregations. For us, except for the cameo appearance of God once in a while in a song, we don't talk about that particular concept and really haven't for, 133 years. Like London Sunday Assemblies, we meet in an assembly hall. We even have an upper and a lower assembly hall, and we think that language does matter, and we're not into any kind of language of reverence. Thank you very much. We have not, however, always managed to communicate a positive humanist message. And I think that that's one of the things that all UU congregations can learn from the London Assemblies movement is a positive Sunday morning experience. Because part of the program for the London Sunday Assemblies is that they do not talk about religion at all. Live better, help often, wonder more is the motto for the London Sunday Assemblies. Sunday Assemblies is free of the history and the habits and bureaucracy that has accumulated around many of our UU congregations. They can cut that Gordian knot that holds so many UU congregations back from appealing to post-theists who make up a larger and larger part of the population today. So what I want to really ask is, what's churchy about church? What is churchy about church? Because I think that's what Sunday Assemblies and religious humanism is able to get at. What's churchy about church? The 98-year history of First Unitarian Society's overt embrace of humanism is there to show that religion doesn't need to be part of life passages, baby namings, memorial services, or even the Sunday morning assembly. We just don't have to talk about that. Here's how I think about it. But first, allow me to say parenthetically that I am a pragmatist at heart, and therefore I believe that all religious forms are valid or true as long as they work for the population that they are trying to work for. That makes perfect sense to me. Also, I consider myself a post-theist in that I just don't worry about that sort of thing. I use the analogy of a Model T Ford. I wouldn't buy a Model T Ford to transport me around. It's an old-fashioned thing. The God concept is sort of like that for me. I have a new Ford, as a matter of fact, and it works quite well. And there's a little shadow of Model T there somewhere, I'm sure, but it just doesn't matter all that much when I'm thinking about these things. Now, here's what I want to think a little bit about. What's churchy about church? When Imhotep in ancient Egypt invoked the great god Ra, imagine that instead of invoking a true god Ra, actually he was talking to the human consciousness. Or imagine this, when Zadok, son of Ahitub, entered the Holy of Holies of Solomon's brand new temple. Perhaps, just imagine, he was talking to the greatest power in the universe, the human imagination. Or, imagine this, when the evangelist Billy Graham made his vast altar calls in stadiums across North America, the Christ that thousands flocked to was perhaps the human psyche. Whatever you think about the powers beyond, just try to imagine that for a moment. Entertain the thought for just a moment that every shaman and priest and prophet who has ever lived and created all kinds of sacred worship, well, what if there weren't 6 gods, or 3 gods, or even 1? Just try to imagine it. But there is more to the question. Isn't there something else going on in worship? Because even granted the accuracy of my imaginings, didn't Imhotep and Zadok and Billy Graham each have the advantage of speaking to people who shared a subjective reality? Because that's my definition of God, as a shared subjective, maybe reality. But how do we know what we're actually subjectively agreeing on? Well, that's why creeds are good, because you have to say it out loud. But are they thinking the same God? Hard to tell. Didn't the Egyptians of Imhotep's time have a mental image of Ra, and the Hebrews of Zadok's time have a notion of Yahweh, and the Christians of Billy Graham's time a common picture of Christ the Lord? That's a good question, isn't it? Did they really? Are people really like that? Or did the priests and the preachers have rather the apparatus of worship working for them, embedded in a particular place and time, Ra's temple, Yahweh's temple, and the vast football stadiums of Jesus with really cool PA systems? of Christ's as there were Christians in Billy Graham's vast altar calls. Yet they came to that structure of power and fame called a stadium or an auditorium, didn't they, to hear Billy talk. So what's churchy about church? The apparatuses of worship change with time, as do the words and concepts. As do the words and concepts. There's me talking at Sunday Assembly. One thing they beat us, you use that, is they have cool backgrounds, right? And also they insist on TED-style talking instead of reading sermons, as we tend often to do around UU congregations. It is the human mind and human needs for purpose and meaning that remain the same over time, I would suggest, and come to the temple, the stadium, the storefront church. These are what remain the same because the human psyche remains the same. For humanists, that's as holy as it will ever get. And that's fine for us. The proof is in the pudding, after all. And Ra's pudding doesn't do much for many of us today, but the pudding of gathering together into community is a tasty pudding for humanists. Just imagine that the point of worship, or assembly as we call it, is calling individuals into community. Imagine that a community created in this way agrees to agree on something, despite individual understandings, on particular values that sometimes, in the best case scenario, lead to common, objective actions that can be considered moral and ethical. Why would there need to be a God concept involved in that? That's what we call worship, or actually what we call assembly. This is First Unitarian Society's upper assembly hall, mistakenly called a sanctuary at times. You will note it was built as a humanist space, so you'll notice that there's no symbol except for the chalice sitting up there, which is definitely movable, because some of our folks still don't like it. So, gathering to invoke Ra or any of the deities or no deity at all leads to the same thing, doesn't it? It's the human mind imbued with meaning and purpose and communal action that is what really matters. The mission of London Sunday Assemblies is to live better, help often, and wonder more. It's short, it's simple, and it's the best bits of congregational life, and it's the essence of religious humanism. Whatever our religious background or lack thereof, we can find a message in that we can all take to heart. It's the best bits of church with some awesome pop music thrown in, and it works very well for us. I'll be glad to take a few questions.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But let me start by saying I could care less about religion. Quite frankly, you know I'm a minister and I've got a large church. I can care less about religion. What I'm interested in doing is trying to change the world and make the world a little more just, a little bit better. For example, I think there are real hells, but they're in this world. Hunger, poverty, abuse, violence, war. Those are the kind of hells that I think religion needs to be focused on. And churches need to be focusing on. And so I'm trying to keep people out of those hells. And so my attempt to do that is to try to build a strong community of people who can make a difference in the world. And the vehicle for doing that, for me, as a minister, is my congregation. And so, when the first ministry I had was in Boston, at the First Church of Boston, And in that church, I started a service on Sunday evenings called Soulful Sundown. And that service this was back in the 90s, and that service was premised on the idea that there were a lot of young people who agreed with the values of our churches, that wanted to make a difference in the world, that believed in religious freedom and freedom of thought and belief in debate and all of those things, but who were not at all interested in the kind of worship experiences that they found in our congregations on Sunday morning. They didn't want to sing hymns. They didn't care about it. They didn't really like pipe organ music. And they didn't want to sit in a lecture, situation and just be lectured to. And so what we decided to do was create a really vibrant service that included video and rock music and all kinds of different styles of music and performing arts. It was not churchy at all. It was completely humanist, and it used secular ways of understanding, but dealt with themes that were relevant to everybody's lives, like kindness and compassion and forgiveness and love. And so that was where I got involved in doing more of a humanist style service. Then I came to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2000. And that's church, it's a pretty large church, it had about 900 members at the time, and it had 2 services on Sunday morning that were identical. 2 of the same services, traditional Unitarian services. But I started in my first year a Soulful Sundown service, and we started to draw new people into this service who would never come to our Sunday morning service, particularly a lot of young people. Well then, fast forward to 2008, and there was a minister named Bishop Carlton Pearson, Church of God in Christ, who worked with Oral Roberts. He's African American, and he had a church of over 5,000 members in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Very charismatic, very dynamic, Pentecostal, speaking in tongues, all of it. And he came out as a Universalist. Theologically, he didn't even know what a Universalist was or knew that we in this denomination even existed. But he started to preach that there is no hell, and that Jews aren't going to hell, and atheists aren't going to hell, and Buddhists aren't going to hell, and that we should stop preaching that. Well, unfortunately, when you're a televangelist and you're well known all over the country and you start saying things that go against traditional Christian dogma, other televangelists start calling you a heretic. And so pretty soon, after being labeled a heretic in Christian magazines and television programs, his church dwindled from 5,000 down to 300 members. And after that, he eventually made his way into our church when we invited the remains of his congregation after they lost their building and their TV show and everything else to meet in our church as a separate church. But eventually, he and his wife decided to enroll their children in our Sunday school and to become members of our church, and invited the rest of their congregation to do the same. Well, that was all great, except that the services that we had weren't really that appealing to the members of his church. So we decided to take one of our 2 services and blend it together and use a combination of what we do as a more traditional Unitarian church, Universalist church, and what they did as a more high-energy, evangelical, Pentecostal, and in this case, African-American church. And so this was really exciting. Their praise choir joined ours, and we had people hold their hands up and praising the Lord in our services. And as you can imagine, it created some level of conflict and dissatisfaction among some in our church community. But it was a very exciting time, and it took us a while to sort of figure out what we were doing, why we were doing it. Some people left, a lot of people stayed, and a lot of new people joined. But there was a feeling in the church that we had now become more theistic, and that we have become even a little bit more Christian, and that we certainly had become more evangelical sounding and feeling, and there was a feeling that we almost had started to adopt more of the culture that was around us, and so many of our members had come to All Souls to escape. So we decided 2 years ago to start a humanist service. For those who wanted a service where there was no mention of God, no mention of Scripture, no prayers, no hymns. And so it's a service that we call The Point, because we just get right to the point. We don't have a whole bunch of other. We have some great jazz music and other instrumental music and different bands and folks, instrumentalists will come in. The music is always stellar. and then we deliver a message that is on the same theme as all the other services that we have on Sunday morning at All Souls. It's delivered by me, typically, although now we're starting to mix up because we have some other ministers on our staff, so I don't do all three every week anymore. But even when I do, it's the same message, but in three different theological languages. And the theory behind this is to realize that there are certain people who would, if they came into our church and we were reading from the Bible, they would say, you know what, this isn't for me, I'm not interested, I don't want to be a part of what you're doing. I've been in churches like this all my life, I don't care about this. And they'd walk out. And they wouldn't be a part of our church, they wouldn't help us create a better world. They wouldn't get involved in the stuff we're doing, building homes in our community and doing things in the school system and working in Uganda and all the kinds of stuff that we do to try to make the world a better place. So then there's also that group who are more coming, really what this is a lot of people in Oklahoma anyway, are coming out of Pentecostal, evangelical, charismatic churches. They no longer believe the theology of those churches anymore. They don't believe the dogma or the doctrine. However, they love the music and the worship and the energy and the joyfulness, the embodiment of the worship. So what we're doing in that service is we're creating a very high-energy, praise-oriented service, but that has a free religious theology, so it doesn't fill their heads with doctrines and dogmas, but gives them room to make sense of the experience in their own religious life for themselves. So now with the point, which is our humanist service, or as it says, our good without God, for those who are good without God, in that service, it also is just as high energy and just as fun in its own way, just as meaningful and moving, but it's attractive to folks who don't want to be worshiping with their hands in the air or have to talk to their neighbors and do all the kinds of things that we do in that service. But there are also folks who don't want to sing from a hymnal or listen to a pipe organ or sing traditional hymns. So each of these services is an on-ramp into our community so that people begin to learn our values, get involved in the projects that we're doing out in the community, and help us build a stronger community and congregation, and hopefully build a better world. So that's our concept, and my experience is that sometimes one of the best, that one size does not fit all, and if we only have one style of worship, either musically or theologically, then we're probably going to limit ourselves to a smaller demographic of people in whatever community we're in who are attracted to that kind of worship. And the question I have for us is, are we trying to pass on a style of worship? Is that what it means to have a tradition? Is ours a tradition of worship style? Or is ours a tradition of values and creating justice in the world? And if it's about values and creating justice in the world, then there's many different ways that we can approach that in worship. And worship is just something we do 1 hour a week typically. All the other stuff we do all the rest of the week, all the rest of the time, is also what it means to be religious and what it means to be a person who's living a life of meaning and compassion in the world. So for me, worship is how we bring people into our church. And I'll say one last thing since we're talking about the humanist service that I've learned is very interesting. It actually meets the needs of two different groups in our community. What I've found is that 80% or more of the people who come into any of the Unitarian Universalist churches I've served, when they first came in, if you asked them what they believed, they would say they were atheists or agnostic. A certain percentage of those people over time come to realize that they were atheists and agnostic because the only God they had ever heard of, the only theology they'd ever heard of, was something that they couldn't believe in. But that's also not necessarily the only ideas that are out there about God and theology. So there's certain folks who come into that service, the point, and get engaged in our church, and eventually, for some of those folks, they go, you know, I am now interested in learning a little bit about the Bible, now that I see that there's other ways to look at it, that it's not literal, and you don't have to be so dogmatic about it. And some of those folks will move into one of the other services over time. That's not unfamiliar. We don't consider that a failure. And at the same time, for a lot of people in our community, and I think a growing amount of people in our world, and certainly in our city, this is exactly what they're looking for. for. They want some inspiration, they want some hope, they want something that's scientifically relevant and astute and intellectual, but also helps them to give meaning to their lives and understand themselves in relationship to their neighbors and in the wider world with all the suffering that's out there and what place they can have in it. And they don't want to have any relationship to traditional religion or scripture. And as far as I'm concerned, that's wonderful. I'm so glad that we have people coming from many different perspectives. And what I love about having them all in the same congregation is that they all come to respect one another in time. That, atheists and agnostics are often seen by many people in the world as being fundamentalists themselves. That they're just like, if anyone does believe in God or anyone does believe in religion, they must be stupid or wrong. And there's a lot of hard-edged humanists out there. And I think what we find in our church is that folks aren't like that because they find that they're in a relationship with other people who do believe in God and praise God and love God, and they realize, you know what, this is I love this person. We're part of the same community. They work together on a committee or creating an auction, or they play together at the church picnics and do work in the community together. And they say, we're close and we're friends and I can respect you even though you believe in God. And for those who are deep believers in God, they say, and I respect you even though you don't. And so I think that's the kind of world we're trying to create. And if we can bring people together across those theological differences, which also, in our case, has created cultural, ethnic, racial, and other differences and generational, I think that's the kind of world we're trying to create. And like I said, I could care less about religion. I'm trying to create a better world. And I'm just so glad to have a Unitarian Universalist congregation that's so open to allowing us to do that. Today we have 1,100 pledging households in our church, 1,800 adults, and somewhere between 600 and 800 children, depending on how you count the children. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Stedman.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sonia.
And if you couldn't tell by the fact that we're not standing behind the podium, we are not Unitarian Universalist ministers. We are here to talk about reaching out to the non-religious. It was mentioned earlier that the religiously unaffiliated is one of the most quickly growing segments of the United States population, with about 1 in 5 Americans today saying that they are non-religious, that they are not affiliated with any particular religious tradition, and 1 in 3 people under the age of 30 saying so. And that is a category that I myself fall in. I am under the age of 30. I am an atheist and a humanist, and I identify as explicitly non-religious. And I'd like to talk to you about the kind of non-religious community that I work in today. But in order to talk about that, I would like to share a little bit of my own personal story as a way of explaining how I ended up in the communities that I am a part of today. So, I actually did grow up non-religious. We didn't go to church when I was young. The first interaction I had with church was I was baptized, but it wasn't a particularly religious event. The theological significance of my baptism was essentially non-existent, and one way of explaining that is that the only story that I was ever told about my baptism when I was a child was that when the minister was quoting scripture and said, "Let the little children come unto me," my sister, who was a year older, ran to the front of the church and I lifted up the minister's robes. And while I don't think that was the reason, we didn't step foot in a church again for quite some time after that. It was really just an excuse to get the family together and to celebrate the arrival of a new child. But when I was 11, I had another encounter with religion that was a bit more long-lasting. And that was that I had been invited to an after-school youth group by some friends. It met at a non-denominational Christian church, and I went a couple of times and decided that I was going to convert. And looking back on the experience now, I'm able to identify what I think are sort of 2 primary factors that played into that conversion. The first is that about a year prior to my conversion, I started reading books like Roots by Alice Haley, Hiroshima, The Diary of Anne Frank, These were books that not only informed me of the fact that I lived in a world where people could treat one another in inconceivably inhumane and cruel ways, but they told us stories of what it was like for people who experienced those things in a way that filled me with questions about what it meant that I lived in a world where people were so cruel to one another. And so I was looking for a way to make sense of those questions, a framework for unpacking them, and felt like I lacked that. And then the second piece is that a year later, when I was 11, right around the time my parents, right around the time I converted, my parents divorced. And that was really my sort of foundation as a child, was my immediate family. And so when that was disrupted, I was looking for a safe place to land, a community, a place of welcoming. And this community, this Christian community that I started attending, offered me both of those things. It offered a way to make sense of some of these questions that I had, and a framework to process those things, and a community, a welcoming space. But the church was also incredibly theologically conservative, and not only that, but was really kind of obsessed with sexuality, homosexuality in particular. So there would be mentions of homosexuality in sermons that were otherwise completely unrelated. It was talked about in Bible study group just about every week. The library was full of materials that said that homosexuality was at worst a sign of youthful waywardness or rebellion or confusion, and at worst a sign of demonic possession, which is a terrifying message for someone at any age, but particularly for a vulnerable, confused, and isolated 11-year-old. So I internalized this message, and really it did a lot of damage. I really struggled because I was realizing that I was gay right at that same time, and so I was really struggling with my sexual orientation and with these really fundamentalist beliefs that I had internalized, and I felt as if I had to choose between this community that had come to mean so much to me and really become a sort of core part of my identity, and this other aspect of who I was that seemed to be unchanging. This went on for a number of years until my mother found a prayer journal that I was keeping where I was detailing this experience, and she took me to speak with a Lutheran minister at a pretty progressive Lutheran church who had a very different view on sexuality and who helped me reconcile my Christian beliefs with my sexual orientation. And that intervention was really a huge turning point in my life, because it was the first time that I found a community where I felt like I had a space to talk about values, about what it meant to live a meaningful life, and where I could bring my full self to that community and not have to compartmentalize who I was. And this community really served an essential role for me throughout high school as I began to come out and was at that time the only openly gay person in my high school and experiencing a fair amount of harassment. As a result, I had this really wonderful, welcoming, safe church that I was a part of. And because of those positive experiences, I decided I wanted to go to school to study religion, because I thought I might go into the ministry, because I wanted to help people who were struggling with certain issues in their lives, and the people that I knew who had helped me the most during these really critical moments were Lutheran ministers. So I went to a Lutheran college in Minnesota and started studying religion, and there I was really challenged by my Christian religion professors to ask myself challenging questions about what it was that I believed and why I believed it. And this process really set me on a sort of course to self-discovery, where I really allowed myself to ask questions that I hadn't allowed myself to before, and eventually came to realize that my desire to be a part of Christian communities had a lot more to do with wanting to be a part of a community that oriented itself around a set of values, and less to do with the metaphysical commitments of Christianity, which I had always felt a bit at odds with. It didn't feel natural to me. It didn't really make sense. It didn't align with the way that I saw the world or with my experience of the world, and I always felt like I was trying to lean on a tired cliche to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just didn't make sense to me. And yet everyone I knew in the church said the source of the things that we all cared about, the source of the things that brought us together was God. And so I took it on as a package deal, but when I allowed myself to challenge and think about that, I realized that I didn't actually think that it was true. But upon realizing that, I church, I suddenly felt as if our views of the world were so fundamentally different that we lacked a common language to talk about what our shared values were. And I wasn't sure that we had any at all, to be honest. But as time went on, I had a number of experiences that really forced me to reevaluate my thoughts on religious differences. And I began to seek out commonalities rather than simply focusing on what our differences were. And that moved me into interfaith work, and I became very interested in the idea of finding understanding and commonality. And I was working for an organization in Chicago called Interfaith Youth Corps, and at the same time was going to the Lombard Theological School because I knew I wanted to study alongside people who wanted to work to create these kinds of moral communities, and I wanted to see what it was about the religious approach to this kind of community building that seemed to work so well. And through this process of doing interfaith work and studying at the Lombard, I met so many really incredible and inspiring people who talked about the meaningful role that their religious community played in their lives and how it informed their ability to be people who could work to make change in the world. And that got me thinking about what kind of community was available for someone like me, someone who identifies explicitly as non-religious and yet still wants to be a part of a community that has at its focus, at its center, the big questions that we all ask ourselves and that we all want to explore, the questions of what it means to live a meaningful life and how we can best improve the conditions of life for other people and for ourselves and build relationships of reciprocity. And it was through that process that I began to look into non-religious communities. And at first, my first sort of encounters with non-religious communities were with atheist groups that had as a kind of exclusive focus religious criticism, and it often felt very reminiscent in some ways of the kind of us versus them mentality that I encountered in the more fundamentalist Christian churches that I had been a part of when I was younger. It felt as if I was encountering a lot of people who were using their non-religiosity or their atheism as a way to separate themselves from other people or to feel superior. And that really wasn't what I was looking for. But then a friend of mine, Ibu Patel, pulled me aside one day and said to me, Chris, I don't want to tell you what you are or what you think, but I think you might be a humanist, and you should really look into this thing called humanism. And he was very nice about it, but really sort of challenged me to look into it. And as I did, I started reading the Humanist manifestos. I read a number of books on humanism, and for the first time, I felt like I found a worldview, a sort of description of a worldview that was really consistent with the things that I believe and the things that I value, and that really accurately described how I saw myself. And so, I started to realize that this was, I think, a common experience, that there are a lot of people out there who identify in the way that I do, who are non-religious and who are non-theists, and yet, would really like to have a community and be a part of a community that could help them be a part of these broader conversations, the kinds of interfaith conversations that I was participating in. And sure enough, there's a really excellent book that I imagine a number of you have read called American Grace by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. It reflects on an extensive research that they did into the lives of religious Americans. And one of the things that they found is that religious Americans are much more civically engaged than non-religious Americans. So they give more money to charity, both religious and secular. They volunteer in their communities much more. They're more likely to vote or run for political office. As Putnam and Campbell put it, they are better neighbors than non-religious Americans. But something very interesting about this is that they also found that a non-believing spouse of a religious person who participates in their partner's religious community is just as civically engaged as the believing partner. And based on this, they speculate that the correlation between religiosity and civic engagement in the United States has less to do with belief per se and more to do with belonging. It has to do with being a part of a community where you have a space to reflect on these kinds of questions and then act in coalition with other people. We have opportunities to act on your values and to discuss And it was that recognition that if I wanted to be a part of these interfaith conversations, if I wanted to try and build understanding and commonality and cooperation across lines of difference between those who believe in God and those who don't, that work really needs to be grounded in the context of a community. That people really need to feel like they have access to the kind of community that they feel it reflects who they are and what they believe at their core. And I love the comment about wanting to have sort of different kinds of resources that appeal to the various ways in which people express themselves and sort of conceive of the world around them. Because I think that, I look at the principles of Unitarian Universalism and I see a great deal of overlap with the things that I value and the things that really matter most to me. And, Unitarian Universalism has played a very influential role in the way that I think about myself and about the kind of life that I want to live. And not just because I went to the Lombard Theological School, and not just because Beacon Press is my publisher, but because I have been really influenced by a number of Unitarian Universalists and by studying Unitarian Universalism, and yet I don't identify as a Unitarian Universalist. And even though I understand that just about any Unitarian Universalist congregation that you walk into is going to be different than the last one that you walked into, I have yet to walk into a Unitarian Universalist congregation and feel as if this is my space, or that this is the kind of community that is my home. I feel most at home in an explicitly non-religious, humanistic environment, and I know that there are a lot of other people out there, particularly among the millennials, who feel this way as well. And so I'm really passionate about the idea that these kinds of communities, these explicitly non-religious communities, need to be there to serve those people, just as there are wonderful Unitarian Universalist communities that are there to serve those who are interested in those communities. And the last question that I want to leave you with before I hand it over to my wonderful friend and colleague is, I've been doing a lot of thinking and talking about the non-religious non-theists, but my one question that I think about a lot in the work that I do is the non-religious, the nuns who do believe in God or in a universal spirit, and where they are finding community. Something like around 70% of the explicitly non-religious in the United States say that they believe in a God or a universal spirit. And those, for the most part, are people who will probably not come to a humanist community like the one that I've worked in at Harvard or the one that I'm working with now at Yale. Those are folks who are going to be looking for a different kind of community. And I think that there's a real opportunity there for Unitarian Universalists to serve those folks. And I would love to hear thoughts that any of you have on how to go about bridging that gap. And if there are ways that I can help do that, I would really love to. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I'm probably the youngest panel member up here, and that I have the least explicit. I hear you. Yeah, I can move it. That way I can still look at you. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I'm the youngest panel member up here with the least leadership experience. It's really humbling to be able to stand in conversation with great minds present, both on the stage and off the stage. So thank you for this opportunity. For just a moment or two, I'd like to share with you what I've been working on at the humanist community at Harvard. I'm committed to building community across difference. This has made being in uncomfortable situations fairly comfortable for me throughout the years. I started out this work in high school as a student representative in the Minority Student Achievement Network. In undergraduate school, I became deeply concerned with social justice issues for disenfranchised identity groups across the board. This led me to attend many social justice leadership institutes, and it also led me to my my 3-year journey as an RA and peer mentor. One of my undergraduate professors knew about this commitment that I have to social justice leadership and ministry, past year at HTS, I've been working with the humanist community at Harvard under the supervision of Greg Epstein, Executive Director of HCH and the Humanist Chaplain at Harvard, and under the guidance of Chris Edmond, Assistant Humanist Chaplain and Director of Values and Action, and Zachary Cole, Values and Action Fellow. At the beginning, Greg and I had some very deep, more aptly named probing conversations about my values and thoughts on humanism and building community with a non-religious group because I'm a Baptist. My traditional Black Baptist upbringing, I'm sure, didn't mark me as a dead ringer for building bridges between my background and that of people who see the world without God as I perceive it. But as much as I knew that I had to learn from this, that I had a lot to learn from this community of humanists that I was joining, I knew that I had something to offer, a perspective that would prove useful and was in fact shared by many of the community members at each stage. I worked to reach out to the non-religious community in a way that acknowledged the vast diversity and backgrounds and interests of the community. My job was to help HCH become a safe place for people of color that identify as humanists. By modeling the conversations and interactions we aspire to have, and by identifying the areas where our humanist community could grow and where our administrative team would need to step in and implement concrete, documented institutional changes, is a big part of my work. And it might seem that the work that I did isn't necessarily applicable to an interface setting. And in some ways that might be true, but only because there are a lot of particularities. I'd say that the devil isn't in the details. The adversary is not in the details, for those of you that don't like religious words. I think that the particularities and the places where we're unique and different are the places where we can become the strongest, and the places where we can find that there's discourse in the details, understanding in the details, growth in the details, dialogue in the details, education in the details. The message that I'd like to share with you is that the mechanism for reaching out is applicable to any kind of community building, whether it's interpersonal, or with one's own community, or between communities. In my experience, this has meant setting the intention for my actions and doing a great deal of work to follow through. It's about taking an interest in the success of the people that you seek to reach out to. It has meant learning about the community's particularities and humanizing the groups in order to never render our neighbors statistics. It has meant defining ourselves as one whole, recognizing that though we are different, we still need one another to be complete. It has meant seeing non-religious not as an external group to reach out to, not as an other, but as a group with a theological perspective that is part and parcel to the many universal truths held by human beings to gain an understanding of our shared human experience. Thank you.
I was going to ask two questions, but I'm interested in leaving time for the audience. It's been observed that atheists and agnostics talk more about God than anyone else. But it seems like you are fostering approaches and activities where the God things transcended by opportunities for effective experience, for service and for community. Is this true? And if it is, why?
Sonia wants to repeat. Would you repeat that?
Okay. Somebody said that atheist and agnostic are the people talk most about God. And it seems like in the approaches that all of you are using, you're kind of transcending the so-called God thing by providing experiences, effective experiences, opportunities for service, and real kind of loving communities. And I was wondering if you thought that was the reason, and if so, why?
It's a big question. I would just say that from my perspective, all human beings have a lot of the same needs for care and for meaning and for opportunity to make a difference. We all grieve, we all fall in love, all those different things. And so we need places to celebrate and communities to celebrate those things, whether it's the loss of someone we love or our own fear before terminal illness or whatever that is. And so for me, even if somebody doesn't believe in God or have that sort of concept of traditional religion, they still have those same human needs. So by providing a community and a service where people can come forward and have those opportunities and needs met for them, we're doing a great service to humanity and to one another and creating a real community. So that's how we get around God.
So I think very similarly to what you were saying, we have, at Harvard, we had intentionally interfaith programs, which was a core part of what we did as a community. We saw that as an essential part of what it means to be a humanist community, is to take seriously the fact that we live in a world where many people do not share our views, and that there's a great deal that we have in common that is worth not only focusing on, but searching for. But outside of that, I think all communities, whether they're Unitarian Universalist, whether they are explicitly non-religious and non-theistic, or otherwise, should aspire to be places of welcome for all people. And in my work as a chaplain at Harvard, I met with a number of different students who were not humanists. And it was never my job, no matter who I was meeting with, to tell any of the students that I worked with in a counseling context what they should or should not think about anything that they were working through. My job was to open up a space where they could think deeply about what their sort of utmost concern was and what resources they had at their disposal, and to sort of reflect back what I was hearing. And inevitably, a lot of the students that I ultimately ended up meeting with were people who identified as religious, or were people who had left a religious tradition because of some political issue or because of a particular conflict, but really, in their heart of hearts, sought to reconcile themselves to that tradition. And it was always my privilege to walk with that person through that process, regardless of the sort of vocabulary that they brought to our conversation. So I think that anyone who seeks to organize a community, whether it is an explicitly atheist or humanistic community or otherwise, should have a kind of lexicon at their disposal, should be able to speak many different languages, or if they can't speak those languages, should have the ability to listen to someone and ask them how they can best be with that person and serve that person. And so, I do think that our community, still probably spends more time talking about God than ultimately I think we should, or where I would like to see us be. But I think that, the general direction that we're moving in and should be moving toward is a direction of having the ability to meet all different kinds of people where they are. And that's certainly something that we try to put into practice in our community, and I think it's the future of these kinds of communities, is having the ability to welcome people of all different backgrounds.
Yeah, I think perhaps atheists think that by disproving God to somebody that they're going to change their mind. That's a horrible mistake. It's never going to work, because if you didn't reason your way into it, you can't be reasoned out of it, right? If it's a gut thing, that's why I'm a pragmatist. If it works for you, it works. So the question that I ask always is, when someone comes to talk to me about God, is, well, what are you getting out of that? What do you want out of that concept? It's the tool, right, that that's what I'm looking for when I'm looking for what people are actually talking about. Does it make you feel better? Does it mean that the bad people do actually get punished and somewhere, because they certainly don't hear? I mean, what are you trying to get out of that? And after you find out that, then you can start talking about what to do with that.
So I think something that has come up from our local panel members is that there has to be a certain level of agility that a minister must have. So whether it's being able to speak many different languages, God language and others, or whether it's being conscientious enough to have a service that is specifically centered around the needs of a large demographic of your community. I think it's about being able to read your community. It's about being able to read the people that you're trying to help and making sure that you are being a help to those people. And I think that that's a huge part of how you get around the God thing.
Okay, it's your turn. If you have a question, please come to the mic in the center of the room. Give your name first, please.
Sure, Joy Partain in Houston, Texas. I'm wondering at All Saints with the point service, where is the hymnody from? Where are the songs from? Because I find a limited set of non-theist songs in UU churches.
First of all, I just want to make a correction. It's not all saints, it's all souls. I probably couldn't serve a church full of saints. I would not be the right minister for that church. We actually don't sing in that service very often. Occasionally there will be a breakout in singing, but it's usually because it's a secular or jazz song that's popular that people know. So it may just, I think there's been like a Beatles song and maybe some other song when the theme was maybe around sun or sunshine, and there was a song about the sun, here comes the sun or something, and everybody started singing it. But there's no actual hymn in our service.
Okay, and then a question, I guess, for the crowd. This is my first time at GA, and I've kind of been surprised by the amount of theist music. Is anyone else surprised by that?
It's a little high this year.
Yeah.
I've been surprised too, and I'm more theistic, leaning myself in terms of my own worship style, and I've been surprised at how much there's been in our corporate worship.
Well, I would encourage everybody to write the feedback message. I did. I'm not expecting to change it. I'm a musician. I know the services have been planned. It's too late to change. That wouldn't be fair to musicians. But give that feedback for future years.
Thank you all very much for this panel. While I used the word secular humanism, it's almost in the same sentence. I was wondering, do you see secularism and humanism as the same? Secularism has a pretty pejorative label in our society today. So, what do you think? Do you see it as the same?
I do not see it as the same at all. Secularism is really it's a political ideology that actually allows us to have a pluralistic religious society. So in the fact that we're a secular society, it means that we keep religion out of some places so that we can have religion, and other places so that we can have a pluralistic society where we're not beating each other up. So I'm a proponent of secularism as a political construct and concept. But I see it as very different. It's humanism, which I think is a set of values and a worldview.
I'm PJ Dean from the Unitarian Society in New England. In the congregation, in the service, in the community, I'm really interested in where you're seeing humanism fitting into children's religious education and children's religious education fitting into humanism.
We do a totally UU-based religious education for our younger people. We do have some mentions of humanism, but we, like any UU congregation, I think we don't try to lead anyone to anything. It's like, build the mind and then let them figure it out. It's good Sophia Lions-Foss stuff like this.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think that Sonia's comment about really taking the temperature of your community and asking people what they're interested in and finding out sort of what they're looking for is so essential when it comes to this kind of program, when it comes to other aspects of how you gather and how you build your sense of community. We have the humanist community at Harvard, and now soon to be at Yale, we have Sunday gatherings, and we have really done a lot of work to talk to people in the community to find out sort of what they're looking for and what would best reflect their identity, their values. And so, you know, we for the longest time didn't have music as a part of what we're doing. Then we did, and we tried doing sing-along, and people didn't really like that, and it felt too churchy for a lot of people. We got a lot of feedback on that, so now there's music, but people don't sing along to it. And we're always just trying to, you know, try out different elements and see what works, and it all comes from the community level. And similarly, we have a youth program, we have a children's program, and that is coordinated by a committee, and it's based on the feedback that we get from community members. So yeah, I think it's going to look different everywhere because it will be informed by the members of your community.
I'm Susan McCauley from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Minneapolis. I'm actually a third generation UU, but I've almost never heard services because I'm a church musician. I play in Christian churches. My question is to speak up for a minority that has nothing to do with color. It's for those of us who really want to hear classical music in church, who find inspiration from a Bach prelude fugue, or a personal trumpet voluntary, or English choral music. Now, I've been going to youth services now again for a long time, and it seems like classical music over the years has diminished as new churches are trying to appeal to a broader segment of the population. But what happens to those of us that really want to hear classical music in church, whether we're humanist, or or secular? What place is there for us?
Well, the music director at First Unitarian, where I am, is a classically trained person. That is always a tension because the Sunday Assemblies model is going into pop music. And the classic old line Unitarian, of course, is classical music. So we try to do a little bit of both and rotate. So we have an in-house rock and roll band that plays once a month, but we do a lot of classical music.
And I'll just say, classical music shows up in all three of our services on Sunday morning at different times, and sometimes even at the more Pentecostal-oriented service, when an incredible classical piece happens, especially if we have a soloist or something, everybody usually gets a standing ovation. People are really, really moved by it.
There's a term out there now, spiritual but not religious. What do you think people are saying when they're using the word spiritual? What are they looking for? Can you define that in a humanist sense?
Sure. Well, whenever I hear people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, my first response is to ask them questions, to ask them sort of what that means to them, what their conception of spirituality is. And it's really hard to, and this is, I personally don't use the language of spirituality. Part of why I don't use the language of spirituality is because I think there are so many different operating definitions of it, and that I think if I were to use spirituality, most people would hear me saying something that I don't mean. So I'm a naturalist, and I think for a lot of people, spirituality has connotations of something supernatural. But I do find a lot of people who, I encounter a lot of people for whom the language of spirituality does not necessarily involve any kind of supernatural components. This is the problem that we are facing right now when it comes to the religious nones, the religiously unaffiliated, is that, we have this data that's beginning to emerge on who these people are and what they believe. And yet, I mentioned earlier that around 70% of the religiously unaffiliated say that they believe in a God or a universal spirit. And yet, whenever I see those numbers, my first question is, what do they mean by God? What do they mean by universal spirit? What do they mean by spirituality? Until these people these religious nuns have the opportunity to speak for themselves and are given an opportunity to voice what it is that they believe, that's going to remain a question. And I think that that is the real challenge facing these religious nuns, is because they're not organized, because most of them are not part of any kind of a community, they have less of an opportunity to articulate those things. So I think, there's not a sort of neat and tidy answer to your question, because I think that there are a number of very different and even competing definitions of spirituality that are used. And I think the conversation will continue to advance. For example, Sam Harris, who's a notorious new atheist, is putting out a book this year on spirituality without religion. And it will be very interesting to see what he has to say and what conversations among atheists and humanists will emerge from that. So I think we'll continue to see that conversation evolve a bit.
The term spiritual but not religious, most people don't know, was invented by the founders of the Esalen Institute out of Minnesota in the 1950s. And it did exactly what they wanted it to do, which was to begin to undermine denominational life in the United States. So it's working.
Nice. Okay, so I was thinking that when it comes to asking what other people mean about a word or an idea or a thought, we're like going in the wrong direction. So I think Chris said this really well, but I just want to impress upon that point of asking people who say that, who identify as that to you. Because what we say doesn't particularly matter. It's about what the people who believe this or who feel this way think. And it's about how we can then meet them at the point of their belief, at the point of their affiliation and how they feel. So I think that that's really important, is to ask, not us.